Thank you very much, and thank you, Professor Shafir. That was one of the nicer introductions. We've never even met, and that was a wonderful introduction. So thank you so much. And thank you to the Woodrow Wilson School, the Davis International Center, the Program in Near East Studies, the Liechtenstein Institute of Self-Determination, and the Center for Jewish Life, all of whom are sponsoring today's talk. And I really appreciate that invitation. I'm particularly grateful to my good friend and mentor and teacher and former advisor, Professor Lynn White, who was the person who suggested that we bring this conversation to the Princeton community today. About 9 months ago, I guess, Lynn was, and some of the rest of you were at an event on Nassau Street at the Princeton Jewish Center, which was, let's say, a little bit of a heated discourse about what it means to be pro-Israel in the 21st century in this country. And there was perhaps a little bit more heat than light that day. And I appreciate this invitation to hopefully a less contentious discussion about the creation of a new voice for American Jews when it comes to Israel and the Middle East. It's always thrilling to return here to my roots in the Wilson School. In fact, this is the very hall where I took a class from Professor White, from Lynn, on an introduction to Chinese politics. And little could we have foreseen what has happened over the last 25 years since that course. But I appreciate very much the opportunity to talk to you a little bit about the new Israel lobby and our effort to change the dynamics of American politics and also of American policy when it comes to Israel and the Middle East. The roots of J Street go back about 10 years ago when I returned to the U.S. after living in Israel for several years. I, as well as my family, have very deep roots in Israel and very deep connections. My great-grandparents were part of the first Aliyah, the first wave of immigration to Palestine in the early 1880s. They helped settle Petah Tikva. And then my grandparents were one of the 66 families that drew lots on the sand dunes in just outside of Jaffa to create Tel Aviv 100 years ago. And my father, who was one of the first kids born in Tel Aviv just a couple of years after the city was set up, was involved in the fight for Israel's independence and fought for the Irgun as a commander and reporting to Menachem Begin. So I had many opportunities to travel to Israel as a kid, and I had a lot of involvement in and a lot of discussion in my house about it. But it really wasn't until the 1990s when I lived in Israel that I got to experience Israel up close and learn about it in depth. And these were the Oslo years, and there was a sense of peace, of possibility in the air. I was involved in the campaign of Ehud Barak to defeat Bibi Netanyahu the last time that he was prime minister. Bill Clinton was pouring his heart and his soul into trying to end the conflict. And somehow I think I and many of the people there felt in our bones that it was inevitable that peace was just around the corner and that we were about to end this conflict. And during my entire time in Israel, I felt that wherever I was and whatever context, whether at a family dinner or at the Knesset or working with the NGOs that I was consulting with, there was a free and open political debate. Political argumentation flowed through the veins in Israel, and it was one of the most wonderful feelings for me about being in Israel, to be in a society that was so engaged and so open in its discussion and argumentation about politics. The majority of the Israelis that I met had no patience at that time for the settler movement. That seemed to be a fringe phenomenon. Everybody that I encountered assumed that we were this close to a land for peace deal and the settlers would be brought back and the peace deal would soon end the conflict. So you can imagine my shock on coming back to this country 10 years ago and to my career in American politics when I worked for, as Professor Shafir mentioned, both a mayoral candidate in New York City in 2001 and then for Howard Dean in 2004, and watched them come under vicious attack simply for calling for even-handed diplomacy and for the creation of a Palestinian state. I watched in amazement as American politicians in races that I was working on and others staked out one-sided, in my view, decidedly unhelpful positions on Middle East policy that were urged on them by consultants and fundraisers who fed them stock phrases and lines that they felt they had to use in order to win Jewish political support. And, myself and my progressive Jewish colleagues and friends in politics have watched this happen over and over and over again over the years, not simply in political campaigns, but here in university settings, in synagogues, in the media, in Jewish communal organizations. The guardians of what it means to be pro-Israel, the guardians of the pro-Israel gospel, have set the terms of the debate in this country. The impact, I think, has been startling, not only on American politics and American policy, but on Israel itself and really, frankly, on the American Jewish community. And I want to address each of those three for a couple of minutes, one after the other. First, looking at American politics, in this building of all places, I don't think there can be any argument that Israel's American allies have established something worth studying. One of the most effective lobbies that exists in the United States is the pro-Israel lobby. It has written a textbook on how to have impact and influence in American politics. And just as an objective student of politics, let alone as a friend of Israel, I am in awe of what has been accomplished and what has been achieved by these friends of Israel to promote the Israel-U.S. relationship, to cement military aid, to ensure Israel's qualitative military advantage. These are incredible achievements in an academic sense to watch how this lobby has worked. But there's no question that over time these voices have become further and further right of center. And the voices that are heard in Washington are those of the most hawkish of American Jewish leaders, of evangelical Christians from the far right with a Christian Zionist philosophy, and neoconservative policy analysts who have led our country for 8 prior years into all of the various disasters that we have watched in foreign policy. And more often than not, the voices that have come to speak for this lobby, that have come to represent the pro-Israel community, have not spoken for me. They haven't spoken for my politically active peers, and they haven't spoken for a very large chunk of the American Jewish community, which is, by and large, one of the most progressive communities in this country. American Jews, as you know, have been leaders over the decades and generations in everything from labor unions to civil rights, on issues from global warming to fighting poverty. And don't forget that 78% of American Jews voted for Barack Obama in the most recent elections, and approval ratings for him in the Jewish community remain among the highest in the country. Yet when it comes to Israel, the voices of these mainstream progressive American Jews have been absent. And the passionate, single-issue, single-minded advocates who approach Israel from the right of center have really dominated the debate. Our polling and other polling has shown that majorities of Jewish Americans support a two-state solution. Majorities of Jewish Americans oppose settlement expansion. Majorities support active and assertive American diplomacy to end the Middle East conflict. Yet politicians and policymakers that I know in Washington will tell you that is not what they hear in Washington. They have drawn the lesson that in order to get American Jewish electoral support, votes, as well as donations, they need to be as hawkish as possible on Israel. And once in office, they feel compelled to support symbolic gestures, whether they're congressional resolutions, sign-on letters and the like, that are usually hawkish, one-sided, and pass overwhelmingly, 400 to 20 or 410 to 18. Issues like the status of Jerusalem, the war in Gaza, the need for a settlement freeze are dealt with less as serious matters of American foreign policy than as domestic political footballs, and none of this serves American interests well. Why? Because serious American interests, economic, security, other national interests in the Middle East and all around the world are deeply impacted by this conflict. And the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is exploited by extremist organizations like Al-Qaeda, by hardline regimes like Iran's that have very little interest in the Palestinian refugees and have not taken up the cause because of their humanitarian impulses, but because the ongoing conflict serves their own strategic interests. In fact, at our conference, J Street's national conference just last week, President Obama's national security advisor, Jim Jones, said in his speech to us that if he could prioritize one problem, this is from the national security advisor to the President of the United States, one problem in the entire world that he would urge the President to solve, it would be to end the Israeli-Palestinian conflict as a matter of American national security interest. And when you consider what else is happening in the world, I think it's a pretty amazing statement. And I think that's a sentiment that is widely shared by people from both sides of the aisle, policy experts who come at this from an American perspective, not just from a pro-Israel, pro-Palestine perspective, but from a pro-American and pro-U.S. position. And to the extent that domestic American politics are preventing the United States from engaging as proactively and energetically as possible in solving the conflict, those politics are adversely affecting American interests. So that's number one. Number two, the negative impacts aren't limited just to the United States. They are also having a negative impact on Israel itself. In my opinion, and I think you would find this to be the opinion of many leading Israelis, the single greatest threat that Israel faces now to its survival, to its security, to its long-term interests, is the possible failure to resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict through a two-state solution. The inexorable demographic trends are that in just a few years there will be more non-Jews than Jews in the land between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean. And at that point, Israel needs to make a choice. Does it hang on to the settlements and the territories, or does it get rid of them and remain the Jewish and democratic home that its founders intended to create in the first place? Because you can't have both. You can't have the settlements and the territories and be a Jewish democratic home. And that's the choice that every single recent Israeli prime minister, even those from the far right, has come to recognize. It's what drove Ariel Sharon to disengage from Gaza. It's what drove Ehud Olmert to engage in serious negotiations and to declare last fall that without the two-state solution, Israel as a Jewish and democratic home will be finished. It's what has led Tzipi Livni, the present leader of the opposition, to base her entire political platform on the imperative of ending the conflict. I would argue that none of these are ideological doves. They are hard-nosed realists who care about Israel, and they are reacting to the hard truth that is staring them in the face. Yet still no Israeli leader, not this government, nor any of its predecessors, has had the political strength to make the sacrifices necessary to cinch a deal. In my opinion, the best thing that the United States can do for Israel, and to be a true friend to Israel, is to help her face up to the difficult choices ahead and to actively lead the way to a two-state deal. Even today, the United States remains the only party that can bring to bear the gravitas and the leadership necessary to close this difficult deal. To the extent that the domestic politics here constrain the United States from playing this role, they are doing Israel no service. What Israel needs now is not unquestioning love, but the firm hand of friendship helping it to save itself from a future of never-ending conflict. The present dynamics surrounding Israel are not only hurting the United States and hurting Israel, they are hurting the American Jewish community, from college campuses to synagogues to traditional communal institutions. Many in the Jewish community are gravely concerned about the fraying bonds of connection between young people and Jewish Americans as a whole with their Jewish identity, and that the young people of today will not be there for the Israel of tomorrow. Changing the dynamics of the American Jewish community may not be so relevant to the Woodrow Wilson School and the students of policy here, but I guarantee you it is of real significance to the Jewish students on this campus who I just met with, and to students and Jews all around the country. The Jewish communal conversation on Israel has become unbelievably constrained in unhealthy ways, much as it has in American politics. It is extremely hard today, as an American Jew, to criticize the government of Israel without having to be subjected to charges of being a self-hating Jew, of being anti-Semitic, self-hatred worse. Believe me, I know. That's why a very important part of J Street's mission goes beyond just the politics and the policy work, but is really attempting to change the nature of the Jewish communal conversation on Israel, to broaden it, to add nuance, and encourage open debate. Our hope is to make the debate and discussion in this country as open and spirited as it is in Israel. In a way, J Street really does seek nothing less than to redefine what it means to be pro-Israel in the 21st century. Many of the major players in the Jewish community regularly force discussions of the conflict into an us versus them framework. The world is viewed as a fight between good and evil, and it flows from the neoconservative worldview that I mentioned earlier that drove American foreign policy during the Bush years. J Street believes that to be pro-Israel doesn't require an anti or a con. We want to reframe the Israeli-Palestinian conflict so it's no longer seen in zero-sum terms, so that we can see those shades of gray. We believe the only way to a better future in the Middle East is through a win-win solution that leads to two states for two peoples. So here's what J Street has set out to do over the last 18 months. First, we got engaged in politics itself directly. Probably a politician's greatest fear on this issue is that staking out a position that is viewed as insufficiently pro-Israel is going to cost them in terms of political contributions and support. So we established a federally registered political action committee, or PAC, that can endorse candidates who are running for federal political office, and we raise money for them. In the 2008 election cycle, we endorsed 41 candidates who ran for the House and Senate, and we raised nearly $600,000 for them. That was more than any other pro-Israel PAC had ever raised in any cycle for political candidates. And that sent a clear and powerful message into the political system in Washington, D.C., that meaningful political support could actually be mustered for candidates who stood up for engaged American diplomacy and for the two-state solution. Second, we brought the tools of online activism to the Israel issue. We built on the Howard Dean campaign, the Move On model, the Obama campaign, all of which derived their power from the notion that a large number of small donors can act as a political counterweight to a small number of large donors. Third, we established a lobby, both with staff in Washington that established relationships with offices on Capitol Hill and with donor activists around the country who are key points of contact with members of Congress and other influential political figures in their community. Fourth, we're setting up a grassroots network of supporters around the country. We have engaged the media and created a noisy and public debate whose very existence helps to foster the political space that we are hoping to create. And just last month, we held our national conference with over 1,500 activists, but without the Israeli ambassador, which was a historic gathering that sent ripples throughout Washington, D.C. and the Jewish community. After just 18 months, J Street is making strides, opening up debate, fueling that debate, and creating the clear perception in Washington, D.C. that there is new political space when it comes to Israel and the Middle East. Before I wrap up my prepared remarks, and then I would really enjoy engaging in questions and conversation, I do want to share a few final thoughts as we head into 2010 about what can be done in this coming year and in the remainder of the President's term to end the conflict, and how can we find hope in a generally pessimistic climate and environment. There is no shortage of naysayers and of reasons to question success. I suppose many of you saw just this past week, about 10 days ago, Tom Friedman's piece in the New York Times in which he essentially advised the President to throw in the towel. His words are echoed by many, that you simply can't want peace more than the parties themselves. Certainly adding to that optimistic outlook, the Secretary of State's recent trip to the region provided very little cause for optimism, as she first praised the Israeli Prime Minister for, in her words, an unprecedented offer on settlements, and then spent the better part of the following week clarifying that the offer came nowhere near meeting what she and the President had expected. On the ground, the head of the Palestinian Authority, Mahmoud Abbas, is now saying that he will not run, although there aren't elections scheduled, he will not run again. And his aides are in the media suggesting it's time to shut down the Palestinian Authority. 10 months of serious effort by this administration that began on day one with the appointment of George Mitchell have produced no results. And building of settlements on the West Bank continues apace, suffering in Gaza deepens, and regional tensions rise. Add to this an Israeli government that is perhaps less predisposed to settle the conflict than any of its predecessors in the history of Israel. And you really are left to say, now what? Well, let me comment on a couple of things. First, settlements. There can be no denying that there is little that has been more damaging to the prospects of solving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict over the last 42 years than the occupation and the expansion of the settlement enterprise. The possibility of a Palestinian state has been severely undercut by the settlements, by the roads, by the infrastructure of occupation. The chances of creating that state have actually decreased in the 16 years since the Oslo process began. And it is true that only a complete halt and, in fact, a rollback of what has been built can salvage the possibility of a two-state solution. But that said, I would argue that the settlement issue cannot be the be-all and end-all of this crisis, that the resolution of the conflict actually depends on getting beyond this impasse around settlements and getting to setting the borders of the State of Israel. Once the borders are set, the settlement issue, by definition, is settled. Israel can build to its heart's content on its side of the border, and will have to remove everything that is on the other side of the border. And in delaying the inordinate focus on the settlement freeze, in my mind, has been a tactical mistake. The administration set too high a bar, a zero tolerance for settlement growth during negotiations that it was not able to deliver and never could have delivered. That, in turn, created expectations in the Arab and Palestinian worlds that were then dashed, and it allowed Bibi Netanyahu to enhance his weak political standing in Israel by looking strong in standing up to the United States and winning. So what is the right approach? I counsel a tactical retreat, the way that the Obama administration has engaged. To my mind, the right move right now is to back away from a discussion of the settlement freeze and to focus on the actual final core issues of the conflict. It is, I believe, the right move in order to get the parties back to the proverbial table. But that leads me to my second comment, that focusing on getting talks restarted is, in my mind, again, a false milestone of success. The parties have been at numerous tables. They've been at the table for 16 years, and they've had Annapolis, the roadmap, the this, the that, Y plantation, the various different accords that have been signed, and they have been unable to conclude a deal. And left to their own devices, the parties themselves, I believe, are still incapable of closing a deal. They need outside help, and that's where the U.S. should focus. Let's not forget that the solutions to the fundamental issues are well known. The majority of the people on both sides do support and understand the broad parameters of a final deal. It is time for someone to put a plan on the table that addresses the issues and to begin working it through with the sides. Perhaps it's in side-by-side negotiations. Perhaps it isn't head-to-head. Perhaps it's the U.S., perhaps it's the Quartet, perhaps it's with the Europeans and the Arab League. But somebody needs to come to the table with the players and start to hash through the difficult final status issues. It's my hope that the Obama administration will devote the energy and the focus in the early part of 2010 to that process when they are past the health care debate. For those of us who have been following this issue now for a couple of decades, there is unquestionably a sense of fatigue and a bit of despair. It always seems to be 11:59 on the clock, and the elusive window of opportunity always seems about ready to slam shut on our fingers. But I would argue to the contrary of Tom Friedman that there is no alternative. For those of us who care about Israel, for those of us who care about all of the people of the Middle East, for those of us who want a future that is not one of violence, conflict, and despair, but one of hope and prosperity and freedom, there is no other choice but to reach a two-state solution and to rededicate efforts to get there now and to end this conflict as quickly as possible. What is amazing to me is you get no argument on the basic contours of an agreement from the overwhelming majority of people, from Israelis, from Palestinians, and from Americans. You can walk up and down the halls of Congress and not run into a member of Congress who will disagree with the basic parameters. Most people will even agree on the details of the content of those parameters. What is missing is the political will to bring this resolution to fruition, and that is where J Street comes into play. We, I hope some of you, and I know our 115,000 supporters are hoping to bring a new voice, a new energy, a new perspective onto the pro-Israel scene in this country and hopefully act as a tipping point toward bringing this conflict to a negotiated, diplomatic, and hopefully rapid resolution. Thank you.
I think you select your.
Sure.
Please limit your questions to questions, if possible. Thank you.
All right.
How do you propose framing? You said that we need to reframe it away from us and them. I think that's very much true. When talking with other American Jews, you have any ideas about how to start shifting them? It's definitely a huge problem. I say anytime I've tried to provide a criticism of IDF, I definitely get called an anti-Semite.
Well, I think that the reframing really needs to be around understanding that there are two sides to the story. And no one really does own the truth. And if there's going to be a resolution to the conflict, it's only going to be if we don't fight over our narratives of the past, but we think about how we can create a better future. And to try to shape that future so that it isn't just one person wins and one person loses, but how do we both win? How do we make this a win-win situation? I think the focus on the past is what leads to most of the conflict. Everybody wants to be the bigger victim. Everybody wants to show that the other side has more blame or that they have none. And that's not the way to solve a problem. That's a way to perpetuate and deepen the conflict. So I think keep a future focus and try to show that it can be a win-win. There are microphones at the bottom of the stairs. Whoever gets there first gets to ask questions.
Hi, I just wanted to know your opinion on whether,
Although the microphones aren't on. So that's
on whether Israel has a partner for peace, the role of Hamas, and the dynamics of, I'll use the word imposition, of a settlement on the Palestinians.
I think there is a clear partner in the broader Arab community, which has come a very, very long way from Khartoum in 1970 to Beirut in 2002. The Arab League initiative, which essentially offers full, final resolution of the entirety of the Arab-Israeli conflict, I think is the single most important development that's happened in the last 6 or 7 years. I think it would behoove Israel to accept that proposal and to say, okay, that is the basis for us to work on the details. That's the resolution we would like. So I think the offer is on the table from a real partner. I think that the security guarantees, which is what Israel really needs, I think that the single most important stumbling block for Israelis is to imagine that there is some way that the West Bank can be controlled and not turned into Gaza, and have a security situation there that actually does not have rockets flying into Jerusalem. I think that the Arab League and Jordan and Egypt and other Arab countries have a lot to say in how that security regime will be put into place. So I think it does have a partner. I also think that the current Palestinian leadership, while not the strongest leadership one could hope for, is probably among the best we will ever get. And it doesn't get much better than Mahmoud Abbas. And I think the combination of Arab League, Abbas, and the international support that a real agreement would bring about can address those concerns. As far as Hamas, what our position is that you don't make peace with your friends. This is part of the equation. There is support among the Israeli people for negotiating with Hamas. The latest poll this week was 59% supported Mofaz in his proposal to negotiate with Hamas. We're not saying the U.S. should negotiate, but if Israel's ready to do it around Gilad Shalit, they were ready to do it indirectly around the ceasefire in Gaza, I think we in the United States may need to accept that Israel is going to end up negotiating in some format with some of the people in Hamas, and that's the only way we'll get to peace. I'll go back and forth.
Since the chair introduced himself as a former Israeli, let me say I'm an Israeli, and one of the beginners of the Peace Now movement. So clearly, I sympathize with many of the ideas that J Street professes. And I'm not going to dwell on the question whether two lobbies who are on the two sides of certain issues promote or undermine the case of Israel on the Hill. I want to ask you a rather specific question. J Street has endorsed, I read, the Goldstone report, which I think there is a consensus that this is a biased and prejudiced report on Israel. And I wonder how you justify that endorsement and how this will play actually into the hands of those who claim that J Street is...
Since it's a false premise, I'll stop you because we haven't endorsed the report. There is a lot of misinformation. There are a lot of charges and lies.
By the way, just to say, my source was the TNR, was Marty Peretz in the New Republic.
Right, and I would say that Marty Peretz is probably one of the single greatest smearmongers and fearmongers in the American Jewish community. And it is a shame. I've appeared with Marty on radio and TV, and I've debated him. And to me, it's a shame to watch somebody of his caliber descend to the depths of, really misinformation and disinformation. So we have not endorsed the Goldstone report. What we have said is that Israel should launch its own independent and credible investigation, that the charges that are made by this report are best dealt with not in an international forum which has a general predisposition against Israel, but Israel's own system in the past has always launched independent and credible inquiries into this kind of behavior and these kinds of charges, and this is the first time that there hasn't been one. So that's our position. We do not endorse the report. We certainly haven't endorsed anything related to the process at the UN.
All right. You've given me another question. My first question was, what do you think the value and the impact will be of the Gaza Freedom March? My second question might be on, have you read Goldstone's letter on explaining the wrongful decision, wrongful vote that was in our Congress, and have you read the report itself?
Yes, I've read both the report and the letter, and I've met with Judge Goldstone. I've talked to members of Congress about this. The resolution that passed in Congress was despicable, and that has nothing to do with the fact that the report and the process by which the report came into being and the way in which the UN has handled the report are also not particularly helpful. So I think that one of the problems here is everybody uses facts for their own political purposes. The Congress attacks Goldstone personally, which is unconscionable. It misrepresents what his mandate was and what the report said, all for political purpose. And then the UN, in the Human Rights Council, chooses to take only the parts of the report that condemn Israel and move them forward in the process, leading Judge Goldstone himself to condemn the Human Rights Council. So nobody's a winner in this situation.
I missed that last wrinkle. So then the question of the Gaza Freedom March. What impact do you think it will have?
Well, I think, unfortunately, in Washington right now, there's a very small group of members of Congress and a very small group within the administration that is focused adequately on the humanitarian situation in Gaza. To the extent that the efforts to heighten the visibility and awareness can help with that, I think it's really important. We're going to be sponsoring a congressional delegation that will visit Gaza, take members of Congress who've never seen it to actually go see it. I think the folks who have come back, John Kerry, Peter Welch, Brian Baird, Bob Inglis, Republicans, Democrats, senators, members of Congress. Rush Holt. I mean, it's such a powerful, to actually see what is happening is absolutely essential to have an informed dialogue about what needs to happen to improve the situation.
Yeah, that devastation occurred in an area that's approximately the distance between Princeton and Trenton and the swath of towns in between.
I just want to comment that and I'll ask a question out of it, that I think you're really unfairly dealing with the Mitchell people. Their history is 10 months, a year, 2 years of long, under-the-surface discussion, working with people, understanding people, the history in Ireland, the history in Bosnia. That's his modus operandi. And it seems to me it fits exactly into what you want done, which is eventually to put something on the table. And I don't see how George Mitchell can put something on the table if he's out in front all the time making speeches. So right. I would just wonder whether you agree with that sentiment.
I am afraid that I don't see anything positive that has come out of these 10 months. And I don't think that this situation can afford for there to be 6 or 7 or 8 years. I think that we're dealing with a much tighter timetable, and I think the failure to meet even the first threshold that was put out there has so severely undercut the credibility of the process that I worry that this is not a formula for success, the way that they've been going about it.
I think if you underestimate exactly how long it took in various other places to become successful, and then at least one has to accept that his modus operandi has always been to behave this way, and then to put something on the table to do exactly
right.
what it was.
Right. No, I accept that.
Just 3 very pointed questions related to the current discussion coming out of the Palestinian Authority and the PLO about a declaration of independence unilaterally, and what you think that reflects on the status of the process now, on Abbas's position, and whether J Street has any position on that.
Unilateral steps we don't think are helpful, whether it is the expansion of settlements that was announced today in Gilo in Jerusalem, or the threat to declare unilaterally independence. The only way that this is going to get resolved is through an agreement. The folly of unilateralism, I think, was shown in Gaza, and it doesn't work. Even something that achieves an end that we want, which is a Palestinian state, it needs to be done the right way, and I think that's the wrong way.
And And did you think that? What do you think that reflects on Abbas's negotiating position going?
Well, I think that gets back to the question that Michael was asking, which is, I think this is you don't have time. He has very little political standing and capital, and it's shrinking by the minute. And I don't know that he has the time to wait for this kind of a process to play out.
Thanks.
Okay. So I'm just wondering, because I know you're talking about the humanitarian situation. I'm just wondering, because I know you're talking about the humanitarian situation in Gaza, and I noticed that on your website that you said that you're more or less aligned with Tzipi Livni and Kadima, and I know that Tzipi Livni was famous for saying that there is no humanitarian crisis in Gaza, and I'm just wondering why maybe you support Tzipi Livni but not every single thing she says or something like that.
Right. We are not the American branch of any party. There was one news story in Jerusalem Post which actually quoted me as saying, of all of the Israeli parties, which is the one that we are closest to in our positions. I would retract that comment. Everybody makes mistakes. That was a mistake on my part because we have no business weighing any particular party in Israel, and that is the only time we've said it. It's not on our website. It's certainly not an official position. So I retract that comment formally, and I don't think that either she should be held accountable for our positions or us for hers. The humanitarian situation in Gaza does need to be addressed. It is a security issue. For Israel, it is a security issue for the United States, and it should be dealt with out of Israeli self-interest by the Israelis, even if they don't feel any compassion. They should be dealing with it because it's their own self-interest to deal with it.
And then I was also just wondering, you're talking much about lobbying to get a political agreement between both sides. Do you think that that would be effectively end the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, having something between the Israeli government and Palestinian Authority?
Well, I think it's absolutely critical, I said before, to engage the Arab League. I think that what settles this conflict is when the broader Arab community and the Palestinian people both sign off on this. I mean, this is a conflict that must end regionally and comprehensively, and it isn't enough, actually, to just have the two sides.
Do you think that would be effective at actually changing things on the ground and not just at the political level?
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, I think that there will continue to be terror on both sides. There will continue to be extremists who will try to destroy the peace, and those of us who are the moderates and the majority will need to accept that and stand tough and firm, and those people will over time fade away. But we need to know that it will not end on the day of the agreement, and we're going to be dealing with it for a long time.
Thank you very much.
Jeremy, I wonder if you might be able to speculate for us for a bit on what you think the desired end state is of those in the American Jewish community who've been most fierce in attacking you. Do they even have an end game? And then let me proceed to the real, that's speculative. And then to your organizational issues, the many layers of Jewish community in the United States, the synagogue networks, Young Judea, and so on, are these places where you have yet been able to establish some traction? Because there's an internet, new generation place for approaching people, but much of American Jewish life is through these traditional meeting places of community.
Right.
Do you find differences between the Reform and conservative and Orthodox rabbi networks, for example? Mm-hmm. Where do you find traction? And then, because the conservative or the hardline element has found this peculiar alliance with evangelical Christians, is it radioactive for J Street to have Christian allies? And if so, where do you find them?
Well, all right. Well, we have 20 minutes, so I can probably... So first, there's only one other person in line, so I have 20 minutes to answer. First, on the issue of the status quo, I actually can't understand what the other side is arguing for, because the simple defense of the status quo, that Israel can do no wrong and we must just persevere, this demographic argument to me trumps everything else. The fact that Israel just is standing in the path of an oncoming express train that's just going to mow it down, and it will not be able to be a Jewish and democratic home, and the status quo is unsustainable. So I don't know what the alternative is. I find that to be the weakest part of the proactive argument of our opponents. I won't speak for them because I can't answer that. but I think that is the fundamental question. Second, in terms of the traction that we've had in the established community, one thing to bear in mind is of American Jews, only 40% are actually affiliated with a synagogue. Far less than that pay dues to a federation or are engaged in a traditional organization. One can speculate chicken or egg, whether or not, feeling at home in those places, is contingent on how you feel about Israel and is it an open and welcoming environment. But the fact is that a large percentage of our support, I do think, comes from people who are a little bit disaffected from some of the traditional organizations. There's no blanket answer to a question like this, because of course we draw a lot of support from people who are active members of federations and of synagogues, and members of AIPAC are supporters of J Street too. So you can't give a blanket answer. I do think the younger generation is finding very different ways. The younger progressive American Jewish generation is finding some very different outlets for their activism through community service programs, through Jewish Funds for Justice, through a whole array of new and independent, what are called havurot, independent minions that are not formal congregations but are studying text and being religious in their own way. And all of those add up to hundreds of thousands of people that are outside the traditional structures, and we really have resonance with those folks. But that said, we've just integrated a rabbinic cabinet with 1,000 rabbis. Out of the 6,000 in this country, 1,000 of them are on our rabbinic cabinet. So mostly reform, a lot of reconstructionist. We have a lot less traction with the Orthodox.
Excellent presentation, thank you.
I forgot the third question. Oh my goodness, I'll answer it later.
As important as a two-state solution is, it would be pretty easy to argue that most Americans are vitally concerned with the possibility of an Israeli military attack on Iran or vice versa. What's your view on that?
Our view on Iran is, first, we have to take it very seriously as a threat. There is no question that the expansion of nuclear weapons anywhere in the world is a serious problem, and this president is committed to rolling back nuclear weapons and to fighting proliferation wherever possible. So this is a national security interest to stop Iran from becoming a nuclear power. It's also an Israeli interest. The question is how best to do it. Our view is the diplomatic route that the president has chosen for these past 10 months is the preferred method, but it may not work. The offer is on the table. We'll find out soon whether or not the Iranians are actually going to accept it. And if they don't accept it, there do need to be consequences. And I think our view is those consequences should be international sanctions. They should not be unilateral sanctions. It should be as broad a base of international actors coming together, either through the United Nations and the Security Council, but if they're unwilling to act, then some broad coalition of countries. The absolute bottom preference for us would be any sort of unilateral sanctions, which is what Congress has been considering, and we have been saying don't act on those unilateral sanctions. Let the diplomatic process play out, then go to the UN, then try to build a coalition, and only at the end of the road consider unilateral sanctions. If I may, I'll just quickly return to the role that potentially there is in such a movement for non-Jews. J Street is explicitly primarily, but not exclusively Jewish. But I think the primarily is key. If our analysis is right, that the political problem that is the cork in the system here is the way in which the Jewish voice is presented in Washington, then we have to present an alternative Jewish voice. And it really needs to start there. And I think that the alliance that the right of center has struck with the Christian Zionists, the far right of the Christian Zionist movement, is a very, very potent tactical alliance, and similarly we can strike a potent tactical alliance with the mainline churches, with progressive evangelicals, and with Muslim American groups, with Arab American groups. I'm very proud of how closely we work with Arab Americans and Muslim Americans to try to promote the two-state solution and peace. And I think that kind of tactical alliance is important, but this movement at its core needs to speak for this Jewish community.
Traditionally, quite a few of the traditional Jewish lobbies and pro-Israel lobbies in D.C. have thrown their political clout behind Turkey and trying to strengthen the Turkish-Israeli relationship also preventing issues like the Armenian genocide from coming up in Congress. I'm wondering, given the somewhat erratic behavior on the part of the Turks and Turkish government recently, and the statements by the Prime Minister there, how does J Street see the evolution of the Turkish-Israeli alliance and the lobbying efforts in the American community regarding Turkey? And second, what do you see as the future of the Syrian-Israeli diplomatic track, and what's the best way to restart negotiations there? After a negotiated settlement with the Palestinians, or perhaps as something that can lead into it?
And the Turkish role in that has obviously been critical. I mean, that's an essential part of it. We, as a relatively new lobby and with relatively limited resources, have not ventured far afield from our primary purpose on the two-state solution and on Arab-Israeli peace. And so we haven't, as an institution, gotten engaged on the Turkey issues, and I know that they're very important, and the Jewish community has played a real role. But J Street itself has not, at this point, gotten engaged in it, so I don't want to outline a specific organizational position. I mean, I agree with you. It's extremely important. I think it's really important for Israel and friends of Israel to understand the consequences of Gaza. J Street said when Israel attacked Gaza, it's justifiable to defend yourself. It is understandable to strike back when someone has fired 8,000 rockets at you. But you have to, just because you have the right doesn't make it right. And you have to consider the strategic consequences. The tension between Turkey and Israel right now and the fraying of that important alliance is one of the strategic consequences of the Gaza attack. And for all of those who knee-jerk respond and say, well, Israel was right, of course it had to strike back, you have to think before you strike. And this, I think, is playing out. And I just, again, I'm not going to comment on the specifics of the U.S.-Turkey issues, but in terms of the importance of Turkey to Israel, I don't think it can be overstated. And I really wish that, again, Israel and pro-Israel advocates would think about how what happened in Gaza has been reflected in the relationship with Turkey. As far as Syria goes, the way, if I had my druthers and I could lay out the ideal world, it would be resolved as part of a comprehensive Arab-Israeli peace. And you would have separate tracks going within an umbrella process, and you would resolve all of these conflicts at once. And that's, again, the Arab League initiative, is settle all of the territorial questions, settle the Golan, settle Shaba Farm, settle the West Bank and Gaza, and then you will have comprehensive peace. So I wouldn't say trade off one versus the other, and that's been a game that Israel has played for 16 years, trying to just maneuver and manipulate, and I don't think it serves interest to think in that context.
It seems like J Street has tried to position itself as representing the center of American Jewish thought, with critics from the right and from the left. And I'm wondering to what extent this is a strategic decision and how you think about the politics of which issues to emphasize.
Well, it's not so much a political or strategic decision. I think it really is representative of where we are at, the people involved with J Street. We don't believe in a one-state solution. We just don't. That's not a solution. It's a nightmare to us. The whole idea of boycotting and divesting from Israel is something we can't relate to. We are pro-Israel. We support the state of Israel. We support the idea of a state of Israel. I think that is just fundamentally puts us in the middle, and separates us out from folks on either side. So I don't think it is so much a matter of strategic positioning. I think this is where a lot of Jews are at.
A moment or two ago, you said something very important, which was that J Street's function was to counter the Israeli lobby's right-wing motif or leanings. The Israeli lobby in America today takes a very strong position that they are not espousing a particular point of view about a solution to the peace process, as J Street does. Rather, the current Israeli lobby in the U.S. takes the position that whatever the government of Israel is espousing, their mission is to make U.S. government officials aware of the importance of good relations with that government. So that's the crucial difference. Now, I wonder, and there are certainly many examples over the past 10, 15 years of land for peace, two-state solutions supporting governments in Israel, during which time the lobby in the U.S. lobbied for that position. So what is your reaction to that whole long-winded question, which is not a question?
No, and I think it's a very legitimate presentation of an alternative view. I just don't agree with it. The traditional lobbies say that that is what they do. The reality is, for instance, take the unilateral withdrawal from Gaza. If that were a military attack on Gaza, let's just say, you would see press conferences, ads, a full rollout of support for the state of Israel. When Sharon announced the withdrawal from Gaza, you could have heard a pin drop. Not one ad, not one press conference, not one lobby day organized to support it. When Rabin started the Oslo process, he came to this country and pleaded with AIPAC for support. And in the end, created an alternative group because he couldn't get it. And when Barak pursued peace in 99 and 2000, it was not possible for him to get a rousing standing ovation from major Jewish organizations for what he was pursuing. I understand that this is the argument that is made. I would just question whether or not the facts of the last 16 years bear it out. We do have a particular point of view. I do not dispute at all. We have a very clear position on this conflict and on what is best for Israel, and we disagree with the current government of Israel on many things. It's not our role to be a pro-Israeli government lobby. We are advocating for what we see as the interests of the United States, of Israel, and the American Jewish community. So it's a different role, and I understand that that rocks the boat a little bit. Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't see you. I apologize.
I have a bad back, so I have to sit down. I've been following this for the past 50 years and traveled widely, both in the Arab Middle East and to some extent in Israel. I have been saddened by the fact that although there's obviously a diversity of opinion, one-sided, but there are diversity in Israel, which has, until the last few years, not been reflected in the U.S. In the U.S., if you didn't agree with what the Israeli government did, you were storm-trooped by AIPAC and people who were afraid that if you didn't support the government, you were somehow against the state, which is not the case. This has changed over the last few years. Over the last few years, when, for example, Ariel Sharon, as a young lieutenant, went throwing grenades into the houses of Palestinians whom they disagreed with because they wanted to farm their own land, nobody said anything. Tip O'Neill said all politics is local. And in this country, everybody was worrying about everybody was worrying about their local election. I applaud J Street for providing a countervailing thing to that. But I wondered if you had any comment on my comments.
Well, I think what I said in my speech sort of stands for itself, which is redefining the concept of pro-Israel is in fact what J Street is about. I mean, it is counter to the traditional view that to be pro-Israel is simply to support the government, but in our view, it is to stand up for what we see as the best interests of the future and to counter this sense that there is no future to the status quo. We'll take two more, Patty? Or?
Just two questions. You referred rather elusively to a consensus in Congress and elsewhere about what the general parameters of a solution would be. And I was wondering if you could elaborate on that, both with regards to a two-state solution, what exactly that would look like in terms of borders, Jerusalem, right of return for Palestinian refugees, and secondly, whether you have a vision for what the status of Palestinian Arabs living in Israel as citizens of Israel would be under a two-state solution. And you've spoken about your insistence and your insistence on the continuation of Israel as a Jewish and democratic state. And given the status of that community as it has been in the last several decades, is it possible to foresee a future in which that community retains rights as a community, communal rights, and still lives in a country which is Jewish and democratic?
And I think it's really important to emphasize the way you just phrased it, which is a country that is Jewish and democratic. I don't use the phrase Jewish state, because I think that there has to be a distinction between the way the rule of law operates, which needs to recognize all citizens regardless of religion and race and gives them equal rights, and being a home for the Jewish people. This land, this Israel, I hope will always be the home of the Jewish people, and culturally and ethnically will have a tie to the Jewish people, but everybody who lives there has to have equal rights. So we are not only pro-Israel and pro-peace, we're pro-justice. And we do stand for the notion that this has to be a democratic state that recognizes the rights of all its citizens equally, including the non-Jewish minority. In terms of the outlines of the two-state solution, they are well known. Borders based on 67 with land swaps so that there's 100% land return. The notion that there will be a Palestinian capital in East Jerusalem and a Jewish capital in West Jerusalem, that there has to be a shared arrangement for the Holy Basin and for the holiest of sites that perhaps doesn't incorporate sovereignty to any one nation, but has a shared sense of universal sovereignty. And in terms of refugees, the home of the Palestinian people will be the Palestinian state, and the home of the Jewish people will be Israel. And there has to be a recognition of the wrongs that were done on all sides, but the right of return will be exercised to the Palestinian nation and not to the land of Israel. And that, I think, is, the Clinton parameters, it's the Geneva Accords, it's widely recognized across policy circles as the outline.
What would J Street's position be on an issue like reparations, for instance, for Palestinian refugees?
Absolutely must be a part of it. Absolutely must be a part. That the right, the correction of the wrong must be repaired through compensation, but not through the return to the land of Israel.
I have a question concerning your position on the settlements. And if you put that into context, how can the United States be seen as credible within the Arab community when we have consistently permitted settlements, increased, when we have yielded on the question currently of the increase? It's not natural growth anymore. We now see thousands of units being asked for. We also have a position where the United States allows tax-free contributions to settlements. We currently have Dov Hiken in Israel suggesting that to the Jewish community, instead of buying condominiums in Miami, that they buy them in East Jerusalem. And the problem is that without credibility within the Palestinian community, how is the United States going to be treated as a broker? And the problem is that as we see the second part of my question. As we see the settlements grow, we see as recently as this week with the Samson Battalion, they've had indications there that they will not support removal of settlers. The same thing occurred last week. Netanyahu today gave statements that this kind of rebellion in the army is destructive. We also see that within the army itself, that the number of religious and nationalists is growing, and that the IDF itself now gives awards to yeshivas for the ones that produce the most into the Israeli army. So I think I'm disagreeing with your position that settlements aren't critical. I believe unless that issue can be addressed first, then the credibility of the United States...
I certainly don't mean to say that settlements aren't critical. I mean, I think in my speech I was very clear the single greatest disaster that's happened to the state of Israel is the settlement enterprise and what it's done to the chances for a Palestinian state. The question is, are we going to spend 7 more years of, hopefully, or maybe 3 years or 7 years of this administration banging our head on the wall to get a settlement freeze in order to get to final status talks, or should we just get to final status talks? And that's all I'm saying. I'm not disagreeing with anything that you're saying about the evil of the settlements and how bad it is for Israel and for the region and for the U.S., but are we going to get anywhere by continuing what's been going on? I mean, again, Michael, we'll continue that conversation later wherever you are. But, this is a choice. We can continue to hit our heads on the wall on this for the next few years, or we can begin to engage seriously about where is that border? Where is that adjustment? Where is the 67 line going to be swapped? What are going to be the borders? Let's get that settled, and then you've answered the settlement question. It seems to me that that's the way to resolve the conflict, and the other way is simply going to result in 7 years of stalemate and no progress.
Did the United States unilaterally recognize the 67 borders and suggest that position be taken up with the UN, just as the UN in 48 recognized the creation?
I mean, I think that the U.S. position, and again the generally accepted position, is it isn't going to be precisely the 67 border. So I don't think it makes sense to do that. I think that it does make sense to draw a map and begin to negotiate it out with the Israelis and with the Palestinians and the Arab League, because we all know where the adjustments need to be made. Those maps exist. So I wouldn't go down that road. I think that would be a wrong move, but I would say let's just set the border.
I want to thank Jeremy not just for a wonderful afternoon, but also...
Thank you very much.